Kant did something which has misled generations of Kant students about what's going on in the critique. Kant published the critique, and it was not a rave success. I mean, it didn't fly off the bookshelves because people found it very hard to understand. It might have been more an amusement than a labor for Kant to flesh it out, but it was really a labor for people just to get through the surface of the book. So a couple of years later, Kant published a little book called the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, which was designed as a kind of trot to the critique, a CliffsNotes to the critique, so to speak. It was designed to help people into the critique. And in the Prolegomena, Kant distinguished between two different modes of exposition, what he called the progressive mode of exposition and the regressive mode of exposition. Now, in order to explain this, I'm going to write something on the board. I apologize profoundly for the fact that I have the world's worst handwriting, but there's nothing for it. I have to put this on the board. What I'm going to do is put a series of syllogisms on the board, 3 of them, which constitute, I love this phrase, I say it whenever I can, they constitute a ratio sonatio polysyllogistica. Any of you ever encountered that phrase? Some of you have. It's one of my favorite phrases. I say it at night to help me go to sleep. Here's an example of a ratio sonatio polysyllogistica. I'll just put up letters because my handwriting is too bad. Whoops, that's bad. For those of you who are watching this, I just lost my mic momentarily, but I will put it back on and presumably we'll be all right. There we go. The first proposition is Socrates is an Athenian. The second proposition is all Athenians are human beings. From this, we draw the conclusion Socrates is a human being. This is a syllogism in Barbara. Now we form a new syllogism in which the conclusion of the first one is the premise of the second one. And this one reads, Socrates is a human being. All human beings are animals, from which we draw the conclusion Socrates is an animal. A is different from ATH. Now we form a third syllogism in which Socrates is an animal, which is the conclusion of the second one, becomes the premise of the third one. And the third one is Socrates is an animal. All animals are mortal. Therefore, and you'll come back to your familiar conclusion, Socrates is mortal. This is a ratio sonatio polysyllogistica, a series of syllogisms in which the conclusion of each is the premise of the next, okay? Kant says there are 2 ways of proceeding in expounding this. Progressively, we can start with the first premise and move on to the conclusion, or regressively, we can start with the conclusion and ascend to the premise. Kant says that in the Prolegomena, he is going to proceed regressively. He's going to assume the truth of the conclusion, and he is going to ascend to the premise. Now, there's a problem with that. And good Lord, Kant knew that there was a problem with it, as we will see. He knew exactly what he had to say. He stuck one little word into a footnote which made it sort of all right. The problem is, that's not the only premise from which that conclusion follows. There are endlessly many premises from which that conclusion follows. For example, we could start with the premise, Socrates is a god. All gods are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The premise is, for the major premise is false. Socrates isn't a god. The minor premise, let us give it to the Greeks, is false. The gods weren't mortal, they were immortal. But the 2 premises, both of which are false, have the property of implying a true conclusion. So if you started from Socrates is mortal, you could ascend to the premise Socrates is a god, and the fact that you were assuming the truth of the conclusion wouldn't give you any reason for supposing that the premise was true. Oh God, what did Kant think he was doing? Well, he knew what he was doing, but he could have made our lives... Now, the problem is, as you'll see in a minute, he was so taken with his way of expounding this that he added it to the second edition of the introduction, which screwed everything up for generations. The problem is this. In the Prolegomena, Kant assumes the conclusion synthetic propositions can be known a priori. And he ascends by the regressive method to the premise, which is presumably, he doesn't say, the categories apply to all of my perceptions. So, in effect, he's saying, from the assumed conclusion, we can get the premise. But it doesn't follow from that assumed conclusion that the premise is true, because any number of premises could be used as the premise from which that conclusion is derived. Unless, and this is where Kant saved himself, if you've ever read the Prolegomena, I'll just tell you that this is in the section called The General Problem, How is Cognition from Pure Reason Possible? And there's a footnote. Even if you've read the Prolegomena, you probably skipped over the footnote. Let me alert you, when Kant puts in footnotes, it's usually worth reading. He says in one of his footnotes, the analytical method, that's what he's calling the regressive method, so far as it is opposed to the synthetical, is very different from that which constitutes the essence of analytic propositions. It signifies only that we start from what is sought, the conclusion, as if it were given, and ascend to the only conditions under which it is possible. The only conditions under which it is possible. Well, that makes everything all right. Let me explain. Suppose that P states the only conditions under which Q is true. Okay? If P is the only condition, I did have a pen here somewhere, and I've left it somewhere. Oh well, here we go. The reason I'm reading this off, for those of you who are students, let me give you a piece of advice. If you ever do any logic in class, write it down, bring it with you, and read it off. Otherwise, you will make a mistake, and you will stand there looking like an idiot, trying to figure out what went wrong. I got to tell you a story. I can't help myself. This was my proudest moment as a graduate student. The great logician Alfred Tarski came to lecture at Harvard. Some of you, if you're logic students, have heard the name Alfred Tarski. He's one of the great figures of the middle of the 20th century. Tarski was a big, bluff, round-faced man with a slow, deliberate manner. We all turned out. I mean, this was an important event. And Tarski had a board there, and he proceeded to deliver a lecture on some utterly incomprehensible subject. I have no idea. I didn't at the time understand it, and to this day, I don't know what he was talking about. But I paid close attention. I was a logic student, after all. And as he talked, he put on the board perfectly inscribed lines of code, as though he were carving them into stone with a chisel. And as he went along, he went line after line after line. And after, I had no idea what he was talking about. And as a student of Willard Van Orman Quine, I had been taught, I'd had it beat into my head, count the number of left parentheses and the number of right parentheses in every logical expression. So having nothing better to do, I counted the number of left and right parentheses. And I noticed he'd left a right parenthesis off line 6, okay? He gets to the end of the talk, and there is that sort of embarrassed pause before the first question is asked. So young Robbie Wolf raises his hand. Everybody looks very impressed. And he says, yes. And I say, excuse me, Professor Tarski, but I believe you left a right parenthesis off the end of line 6. And he turns stricken as though I had called into question the foundations of his life's work. He said, oh, thank you so much. And he carefully inscribed a right parenthesis. Everybody looked around as if to say, Wow, Wolf really knows what's going on. Having made my chops, I then had the good sense to shut up, whereupon Willard Van Orman Quine, who was sitting behind me and who knew perfectly well what was going on, asked Tarski a real question, and the two of them spent the next hour having a delighted debate while the rest of us sat there mystified. I never said another word, but my reputation in the department was made. Anyway, that's why I always am careful to arrive with a piece of paper. Suppose we say that P states the only condition under which Q is true. This means if not P, if P isn't true, if not P, then Q isn't true, then not Q. God, I have terrible handwriting. But if not P, then not Q, we all learn in baby logic, is equivalent to if Q, then P, right? That's equivalent to if Q, then P. So if P is the only premise from which Q follows, then Q entails P, in which case if you assume Q, you can derive P from it, so long as P is the only condition under which Q is true. And that Kant threw in that word only because something in him wouldn't allow him to get it wrong, so he stuck the word only in. Okay, now that still doesn't show you that Q is true unless you can independently prove P. If you can prove P and you can show that if Q then P, if P entails Q, then you're in business. So he's got to find a premise from which P follows, from which he then derives Q, and that premise, we will see, is his interpretation of Descartes' starting point, cogito, I think. Only it's not, in Kant's version, it's not the proposition I think. It is, to get ahead of myself, the proposition the I think attaches to all of my representations. That's where the argument starts, and it leads to the conclusion that he wants. Well, Kant was so enamored by his mode of exposition in the Prolegomena that he stuck it into the second edition of the Critique.